So here we are more than 1 year later, with the Victorian state government about to assume absolute control, an ineffective opposition more focused on internal machinations and reverting to former leaders than on actually holding an extreme government to account, and a list of government rules to live by longer than a bloody Jordan Peterson book. This COVID-19 pandemic has, in Australia at least, become the ultimate referendum on your trust in government. And the Victorian government has wasted zero time abusing that trust to put through some of the most extreme fiat powers anywhere in the country, possibly the Southern Hemisphere. With the Premier's sole discretion to declare a pandemic for 3-month periods at virtually any time, and the SARS-CoV-2 virus here to stay, it's not going anywhere. One thing we can be sure about is that Daniel Andrews will declare said pandemic right through to the next election in 2022, and possibly beyond if he wins it, avoiding the need for any of his oppressive thought bubbles to ever be validated by a representative parliament, which is why it exists. From the Supreme Leader's very own website, delivering on our commitment to crossbench members of parliament, because that's who's really important to these guys. A new pandemic-specific part of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act will be legislated to incorporate best practice public health administration from other jurisdictions like New Zealand, and introduce greater transparency and accountability around decision-making. Well, I'm going to need some evidence of that, Daniel. After considering the advice of the Minister for Health and the Chief Health Officer that there is a serious risk to public health arising from a current pandemic or a disease of pandemic potential, the Premier will be able to declare a pandemic. A declaration can initially be made for only 4 weeks, but can be renewed for 3-month periods until the pandemic no longer presents a serious risk to the community, which, let's face it, the way this government defines things could quite feasibly be never. This framework will replace the current system where state of emergency powers must be renewed every 4 weeks up to a maximum of only 6 to 9 months. Well, Lord help us if Daniel Andrews only had the ability to rule by fiat for 9 months. We'd all be dead. These orders will replace the current public health directions and can include orders to restrict or limit movement, detain or quarantine infectious people or groups of people, as well as regulate activities. The Minister will also be able to issue a pandemic order to a specific classification of person or group depending on their location, participation at an event or activity, i.e. protest against the government, or a particular characteristic such as age, vaccination status, residence, occupation, or living arrangements. Now that last part in particular puts this legislation directly at odds with Victoria's own Equal Opportunity Act, which is just kind of how we say anti-discrimination down here. But it also crosses paths with the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Or at least it would if the very same government that passed these landmark human rights protections for Victorians hadn't carved out massive exemptions for them at every step of the way. They've certainly ignored Human Rights Charter from the start, as in Daniel Andrews' own words,
whether the curfew violates human rights and freedoms. How do you respond?
This is not about human rights, it's about human life.
making no bones about it, our good Premier. If it saves lives, screw human rights. And now he expects you to believe that this new legislation, giving him almost unfettered power, will take account of Victoria's Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. But lest you think my rant is alone in pointing out the dangers of this type of legislation, let's have a look at some of the more well-founded examples. This from The Conversation. The bill gives executive wide powers in the time of a pandemic, including detention powers and the possibility of 2 years in prison for failing to comply with a pandemic order. In one critical way, however, the bill rejects a key parliamentary safeguard that is used in New South Wales and good old New Zealand. Instead of creating a dedicated cross-party parliamentary committee to oversee the exercise of these broad public health powers. It creates an executive appointed oversight committee for this purpose. And I can guarantee you the people that Daniel Andrews appoints to this oversight committee will be vetted 100% to ensure that they are right on board with the government's agenda before they get any such a role. From some of our state's most senior QCs, an open letter in The Age newspaper. The overriding concern is that the bill, if passed, may allow the Victorian government effectively to rule the state of Victoria by decree for the foreseeable future, without proper parliamentary oversight or the usual checks and balances on executive power. The Minister can make a pandemic order whilst ever a pandemic declaration made by the Premier is in force. And once that pandemic declaration is in place, the only other requirement for the Minister to make a pandemic order is that he or she must believe that the order is reasonably necessary to protect public health. Not only is this threshold low, but it does not need to be satisfied objectively. It is enough if the Minister simply believes that the order is reasonably necessary, which makes it practically impossible to challenge the merits of an order in court. You're starting to get a little worried now? How about the ABC, who until very recently had no coverage on the issue whatsoever because, let's be honest, they most certainly do stand with Dan, Dr. Norman Swan and posse. A person who fails to comply with a health order and knows that could cause a health risk to others, i.e. breathing in the presence of someone else, can be fined up to $90,500, while businesses face fines of up to $452,500 for breaching the rules, i.e. refusing to act as enforcers for these authoritarian monsters. But don't worry, because they've also got a little allowance in the new laws that allows people experiencing financial hardship to apply for lesser fines. So we'll leave it at $250,000 instead of nearly $500,000 for refusing to discriminate based on the vaccination status of your customers, even if your business has been shut down for most of the last year and a half by this same government. Look, I know most people out there don't care enough about this stuff to change their vote, or they absorb enough negative material about a wallowing opposition that standing with Dan seems like a reasonable default. And I get that, I really do. But for those of you in the middle, those who aren't bolted to one party or the other, please think again. It cannot get any worse than this. This is genuine political extremism under the guise of requested state of emergency reforms, and those alone have already been extended to the point of abuse since the start of last year. There will be literally no limits to the power Daniel Andrews will hold and exercise over the next several years, even when, according to the new Act, the rate of community transmission of the disease in Victoria is low, or no cases of the disease at all for an unspecified period of time. There could be no cases in Victoria for 1 year or more while the Premier retains the ability to declare a pandemic. And, oh, goodness me. Authorised officers are defined and include pretty much anyone who works for bodies from the local council up to state hospitals. And their pandemic powers are truly terrifying. A pandemic order may include, but is not limited to, an order that requires persons to be detained, requires the detention of persons be extended, prevents or limits entry, prohibits or regulates gatherings, whether public or private, in a pandemic management area, requires the use of personal protective equipment, prohibits or regulates the carrying on of activities, businesses or undertakings, requires the provision of information, including information about the identity of any person, requires the medical examination or testing of persons, or that requires the quarantining, destruction, or other management of disease vectors. That is a virtually unlimited power. These authorised officers can compel your movement, exclusion, the wearing of masks and other equipment. They can shut down your business or severely limit its scope. They can command medical examination and testing, even forcibly quarantine you whether or not you're actually sick. Then there's the jail terms and the massive fines. And look, whilst those construction protesters we all saw on the TV just a few weeks ago at this point might have seemed really selfish and stupid to those of us who've been locked out of traditional jobs for most of the Delta outbreaks, do you really think they deserve to have been jailed for 2 years in what would otherwise be considered a basic and fundamental democratic right? After all, just a few days after New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet threw open the lockdown lever, and didn't see a corresponding massive spike in Delta cases, suggesting, oh, hang on, maybe lockdowns aren't saving as many lives as we thought they were. The Victorian government obviously took hope and followed suit, and now they're using the celebrations and associated tomfoolery to sneak this legislation through under cover of darkness. With the help, I might add, of crossbench senators like Fiona Patten, former left libertarian, who I myself had cast votes for in our very own upper house. Her sheer ignorance of these issues will have her seeking new employment very soon, because you, madam, have been conned by possibly the most wily political operative in the country, maybe even the world. And look, whatever concessions he gave your personal agenda, it's not enough for the permanent shelving of the principles that put you into office in the first place. That's a disgrace, and I really hope you wise up before the legislation gets put to the upper house. On another note, all I can say is thank Christ James Anderson and Ben Stokes have joined the English side for this year's epic Ashes clashes, and let's hope Jordan De Goey's little assault charge in NYC doesn't see him stripped from the Collingwood AFL side. But let's be honest, they have form when it comes to defending their bad boys who excel on the field. But we'll talk about sports and all that jazz on Saturday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Cheers.